In the beginning, there was fear. Not the rational fear of predators or the elements, but something deeper. Something that clawed at the edges of human consciousness long before we had words to name it. Before the great dragons coiled through our myths, before the vampires stalked our dreams, before the werewolves howled at our moons, there was something else, something older, something that emerged from the primordial darkness of our earliest minds and refused to let go. This is the story of humanity's first monster. Not a creature of scales and fire, but something far more intimate and terrifying. A beast that lived not in distant lairs or haunted castles, but in the spaces between what we could see and what we could understand. A presence that shaped our earliest stories, our first religions, and our deepest fears before we even knew we were telling stories at all. To find this first monster, we must journey back beyond the written word, beyond the great civilizations, beyond even the earliest cave paintings. We must descend into the archaeological layers of human consciousness itself, where stone tools lie buried alongside fragments of nightmares, where the bones of our ancestors rest next to the scattered remnants of their terrors. What we will discover is that humanity's relationship with monsters is not just ancient, it is foundational. The first monster was not something we created to explain the world around us. It was something we created to explain ourselves. Chapter 1: The Archaeology of Fear. The cave is called Bruniquel, and it lies buried in the limestone heart of southwestern France. For nearly 200,000 years, it remained sealed, a stone tomb hiding secrets that would challenge everything we thought we knew about our earliest ancestors. When spelunkers finally broke through the calcified barrier in 1990, they found something that should not have existed. Deep within the cave, far from the reach of daylight, lay a series of stone circles, not random arrangements, but deliberate, geometric patterns formed from hundreds of carefully broken stalagmites. Each piece had been methodically selected, shaped, and positioned. The structures themselves served no practical purpose. They provided no shelter, caught no prey, offered no protection from the elements. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the discovery of burnt bare bones scattered throughout the formations. Evidence of fire, evidence of ritual, evidence of something that transcended mere survival. The dating results sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. These structures were not the work of modern humans. They had been built by Neanderthals nearly 175,000 years ago, a time when our species was still evolving in the distant savannas of Africa. Here, in the suffocating darkness of a French cave, our extinct cousins had gathered around fires to perform ceremonies we can barely comprehend. What drove them into these depths? What compelled them to arrange stones in perfect circles and burn the bones of cave bears in ritualistic patterns? The answer lies not in what they were doing, but in what they were doing it for. They were feeding something that demanded appeasement, something that lived in the darkness and required offerings to remain dormant. This is our first glimpse of humanity's first monster, Not a physical creature, but a psychological one. The thing that lurks in the spaces we cannot illuminate, that grows stronger in the places we cannot reach. The Neanderthals of Bruniquel were not just making fire in a cave. They were performing humanity's first recorded attempt to negotiate with the unknown. Chapter 2. The Beast Between Worlds. To understand our first monster, we must understand the nature of early human consciousness. Modern neuroscience has revealed something extraordinary about how our brains process fear and uncertainty. Deep within the limbic system, in structures that predate complex thought by millions of years, lies what researchers call the threat detection network. This network operates below the level of conscious awareness, constantly scanning our environment for patterns that suggest danger. But there is a crucial flaw in this system. It is better at detecting threats than determining whether they actually exist. It creates fear first and asks questions later. For our earliest ancestors, this was a survival advantage. Better to mistake a log for a snake than a snake for a log. But as human consciousness evolved, as we developed language and symbolic thinking, this threat detection system began to malfunction in a peculiar way. It started detecting threats that weren't just invisible, they were impossible to verify. The rustling in the bushes that revealed no predator, the sense of being watched when no eyes could be found, the feeling that something was following, something was lurking, something was there, even when there was manifestly nothing there. This is where our first monster was born, in the gap between detection and verification, in the space between fear and fact. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a creature of pure possibility. It was the thing that might be there, the presence that could exist, the threat that lived in the realm of maybe. Archaeological evidence suggests that this psychological monster manifested in early human behavior in remarkably consistent ways across cultures separated by continents and millennia. The practice of creating safe spaces, circles of stones, rings of fire, barriers both physical and symbolic that marked the boundary between the known and unknown. The development of apotropaic rituals, actions designed not to attract good fortune, but to repel malevolent forces that might not even exist. Most tellingly, the universal human tendency to anthropomorphize the unknown, to give it form, personality, intent. Because, while we could not defeat an abstract threat, we could negotiate with an entity, we could appease a presence, we could fight a monster.
Chapter 3. The Shadows of Lascaux. The cave paintings of Lascaux have captured human imagination for decades. The stunning horses, the charging bison, the magnificent bulls that seem to gallop across the limestone walls in eternal motion. But hidden among these celebrated masterpieces are images that speak to a darker aspect of Paleolithic consciousness. In the deepest chamber of the cave, accessible only by crawling through a narrow shaft that plunges into absolute darkness, archaeologists discovered what they call the scene of the dead man. Here, painted in crude but unmistakable strokes, is an image that has puzzled researchers since its discovery. A stick figure of a man lies prostrate, apparently dead or dying. Above him looms a massive bison, pierced by a spear, but still menacing. And watching over the entire scene is something that defies easy categorization. It has the body of a man, but the head of a bird. Its eyes are hollow circles that seem to stare directly at the viewer. Its posture suggests neither human nor animal, but something else entirely. Something that exists in the liminal space between categories, between the world of the living and the world of the dead. This figure appears throughout Paleolithic art, not just in France, but in caves across Europe and beyond. Always watching, always present at moments of transition, death, or transformation. Archaeologists have given it various names: the shaman, the psychopomp, the birdman. But these academic labels fail to capture its true significance. This is humanity's first monster given form. Not yet the complex dragons and demons of later civilizations, but the raw, primal archetype from which all later monsters would evolve. It embodies the fundamental characteristics that would define monstrous entities for millennia to come. The combination of familiar elements in impossible ways, the presence at threshold moments, the role as guardian of forbidden knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, it represents the first time humans attempted to make the invisible visible, to give concrete form to the abstract terror that haunted their consciousness. By painting it on the wall, they transformed it from a formless anxiety into something that could be seen, understood, and potentially controlled. The cave paintings of Lascaux are not just humanity's first art gallery. They are our first monster manual. Chapter 4: The Mesopotamian Genesis. As human civilization emerged from the caves and began to build the first cities, our monsters evolved with us. In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where agriculture first took root and writing first blossomed, we encounter the earliest documented monsters of human history. The Mesopotamians did not invent monsters, they systematized them. They took the formless terrors of their ancestors and organized them into coherent mythologies, whole hierarchies of divine and demonic beings that reflected their increasingly complex understanding of the world. At the apex of this supernatural ecosystem stood Tiamat, the primordial goddess of chaos and salt water. But Tiamat was not a goddess in any sense that later civilizations would recognize. She was a force of pure entropy, a cosmic entity that existed before order, before law, before the very concept of civilization itself. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, Tiamat is described as giving birth to monsters to fight against the younger gods who sought to impose order on the universe. Her offspring were chimeras of impossible biology, creatures with the heads of lions, the wings of eagles, the bodies of serpents. They were scorpion men and bull men, dragon serpents and fire demons. But these were not random combinations of animal parts. Each represented a specific type of primordial fear that early civilizations sought to overcome. The scorpion man embodied the fear of poison and painful death. The fire demon represented uncontrolled destruction. The serpent dragon combined the ancient fear of snakes with the newer fear of cosmic chaos. Most significantly, all of Tiamat's monsters shared a common characteristic. They were described as existing before names were named. They belonged to a time before language, before categories, before the human mind could impose order on experience. They represented not just physical threats, but epistemological ones, threats to humanity's ability to understand and categorize the world. The victory of Marduk over Tiamat and her monstrous brood was not just a cosmic battle. It was the first recorded instance of civilization defining itself in opposition to the monstrous. By defeating chaos and its creatures, Marduk established the principle that would echo through every monster story ever told. Monsters exist to be overcome, and in overcoming them, we become more fully human. But the Mesopotamians understood something that later cultures would forget. Monsters were not external enemies to be destroyed. They were internal forces to be acknowledged, controlled, and ultimately integrated. Marduk did not simply kill Tiamat, he used her body to create the heavens and the earth. Order arose not through the elimination of chaos, but through its transformation.
Chapter 5. The Egyptian Synthesis. While the Mesopotamians were systematizing their monsters into cosmic hierarchies, their neighbors along the Nile were developing a radically different approach to the monstrous. The Egyptians, obsessed with death and the journey to the afterlife, created monsters that served not as enemies of humanity, but as guardians of cosmic order. The Egyptian underworld, the Duat, was populated by creatures that would have been at home in any modern horror film. There was Ammit, the devourer of hearts, with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. There was Apep, the serpent of chaos, who threatened to devour the sun god Ra each night. There were knife-wielding demons, fire-breathing dragons, and entities of such alien geometry that they could barely be depicted in hieroglyphic art. But these creatures were not evil in any moral sense. They were functionaries in a cosmic bureaucracy, performing necessary roles in the maintenance of universal order. Ammit devoured the hearts of the unworthy dead not out of malice, but to prevent corruption from spreading into the realm of the blessed. The demons of the Duat tortured the wicked not for sadistic pleasure, but to purify their souls for eventual rebirth. This represented a crucial evolution in humanity's relationship with monsters. The Egyptians had transformed the formless terror of our ancestors into a structured system of moral justice. Monsters were no longer random threats emerging from the darkness. They were integral components of a moral universe that operated according to comprehensible laws. The Egyptian approach to monsters reflected their broader understanding of death and transformation. Just as the deceased soul had to navigate a series of increasingly difficult challenges to achieve immortality, humanity as a whole had to confront and overcome monstrous trials to achieve civilization. The most profound example of this philosophy appears in the myth of Set and Osiris. Set, the god of chaos and storms, murders his brother Osiris and scatters his body parts across Egypt. But rather than representing pure evil, Set's actions serve a necessary function. They create the trials that Isis and Horus must overcome to achieve ultimate victory. Without Set's monstrous acts, there would be no story of redemption, no triumph of order over chaos. This Egyptian understanding of monsters as necessary adversaries would prove remarkably influential. It established the template of the hero's journey that would dominate storytelling for millennia. More importantly, it transformed monsters from external threats into internal challenges, aspects of ourselves that we must confront and integrate to achieve psychological wholeness. Chapter 6. The Greek Revolution. When the Greeks inherited the monster traditions of their predecessors, they subjected them to the same rational analysis that they applied to mathematics, philosophy, and natural science. The result was a revolution in how monsters were understood, categorized, and ultimately defeated. The Greek approach to monsters was fundamentally psychological. While earlier cultures had treated monsters as cosmic forces or divine entities,
the Greeks increasingly saw them as projections of human fears and desires. This shift is perhaps most clearly visible in the evolution of the Sphinx. In Egyptian tradition, the Sphinx was a benevolent guardian, a symbol of royal power and divine wisdom. But when the Greeks encountered the Sphinx, they transformed it into something far more disturbing, a riddling monster that devoured those who failed to answer its questions correctly. The riddle of the Sphinx, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening, was not just a puzzle to be solved. It was a confrontation with the fundamental nature of human existence. The answer, man, forced the solver to acknowledge their own mortality, their own transformation from helpless infant to vigorous adult to dependent elder. By defeating the Sphinx, Oedipus did not just save Thebes from a monster. He demonstrated humanity's ability to triumph over existential anxiety through the power of reason and self-knowledge. The monster became a metaphor for the fears that could be overcome through intellectual courage. This psychological approach to monsters reached its zenith in the labors of Hercules. Each of the 12 monsters that Hercules confronted represented a specific aspect of human nature that needed to be conquered or controlled. The Nemean lion, with its impenetrable hide, represented invulnerability as a form of isolation. The Lernaean hydra, which grew 2 heads for every one that was cut off, embodied the way that problems multiply when attacked incorrectly. The Erymanthian boar represented uncontrolled passion and rage. But the Greeks did not simply reduce monsters to psychological symbols. They understood that the monstrous retained a power that transcended rational explanation. Their monsters were liminal beings that existed at the boundaries between categories, between human and animal, between life and death, between order and chaos. They represented the places where rational thought broke down and primal fear took over. The Minotaur, trapped in its labyrinth beneath Crete, embodied this liminal quality perfectly. Neither fully human nor fully beast, it represented the savage impulses that civilized society sought to contain. The labyrinth itself was a symbol of the complex psychological structures we build to keep our own monstrous nature at bay. When Theseus entered the labyrinth to face the Minotaur, he was undertaking a journey into the depths of human consciousness itself. His victory was not just the triumph of hero over monster, but the victory of the rational mind over the chaotic forces of the unconscious.
Chapter 7. The Northern Darkness. While the Mediterranean cultures were developing sophisticated mythologies of heroic monster slaying, the peoples of Northern Europe were creating something far more primal and disturbing. In the cold forests and windswept moors of Germania and Scandinavia, monsters were not psychological symbols or cosmic bureaucrats. They were raw expressions of a hostile and unforgiving natural world. The Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, one of the earliest works of European literature, presents us with monsters that embody pure, unreasoning malevolence. Grendel is not a complex psychological symbol or a guardian of cosmic order. He is a creature of absolute evil, driven by an implacable hatred of human joy and fellowship. The description of Grendel's attacks on Heorot reveals something crucial about the Northern European understanding of monsters. Grendel does not simply kill his victims, he devours them, body and soul, leaving nothing behind. He represents not just death, but obliteration, the complete erasure of human meaning and memory. But Grendel is only the beginning. When Beowulf kills him, the hero must face Grendel's mother, a creature even more terrible than her son.
She dwells in an underwater lair that seems to exist outside the normal laws of nature, a place where fire burns beneath the waves and time moves according to different rules. The battle between Beowulf and Grendel's mother takes place in a realm beyond the reach of human law and custom. It is a confrontation with the absolute other, the completely alien. When Beowulf finally defeats her, using a magical sword forged by giants, he is not just overcoming a monster, he is asserting the power of human courage in the face of cosmic indifference. The third monster that Beowulf faces, the dragon that guards a hoard of treasure, represents something different yet again. Unlike Grendel and his mother, the dragon is not inherently evil. It is a force of nature, awakened to wrath by the theft of a single cup from its hoard. The dragon's rage is not malicious, it is instinctual, automatic, as inevitable as a natural disaster. But the dragon is also the monster that finally defeats Beowulf. In their mutual destruction, we see the Northern European understanding of the ultimate relationship between humanity and the monstrous. We can fight monsters, we can sometimes defeat them, but in the end, they will claim us all. The darkness is patient, and it is ultimately victorious. This vision of monsters as embodiments of cosmic hostility would prove remarkably influential. It established the template for the monsters of horror fiction, creatures that represent not just physical threat, but existential dread, the fear that the universe itself is hostile to human existence. Chapter 8. The Birth of the Dragon. As human civilizations matured and came into contact with one another, their monster traditions began to merge and evolve. The process that would ultimately give birth to the dragon, the most successful and enduring monster in human history, began in the fertile ground where different mythological systems met and cross-pollinated. The dragon as we know it today is a synthesis of monstrous elements drawn from across the ancient world. From Mesopotamia came the serpentine body and the connection to primordial chaos. From Egypt came the association with divine power and the guardianship of treasure. From Greece came the psychological complexity and the role as adversary in heroic narratives. From the north came the raw, elemental hostility and the breath of destructive fire. But the dragon represented something more than just a compilation of earlier monster traditions. It embodied a new understanding of what monsters could be, not just threats to be overcome, but symbols of the fundamental challenges facing human civilization. The earliest recognizable dragons appear in the mythologies of cultures that were grappling with the transition from tribal societies to complex civilizations. The Chinese dragon, emerging during the formation of the first unified Chinese empire, represented the power of nature harnessed by imperial authority. The European dragon, developing during the Christianization of pagan Europe, embodied the old ways that needed to be overcome for the new faith to triumph. In both cases, the dragon served as a bridge between the human and the divine, the civilized and the wild, the known and the unknown. It was powerful enough to be a worthy adversary for gods and heroes, yet comprehensible enough to be defeated through courage, wisdom, or divine intervention. The dragon's success as a monster concept lay in its extraordinary adaptability. Unlike earlier monsters that were tied to specific cultural contexts or religious systems, the dragon could be modified to serve the needs of any narrative tradition. It could be a force of chaos to be defeated, a source of wisdom to be consulted, a guardian of treasure to be outwitted, or a symbol of imperial power to be revered. But perhaps most importantly, the dragon retained the essential quality that had defined monsters since our earliest ancestors first huddled around fires in limestone caves. It was the thing that existed at the boundary between the known and the unknown, the creature that embodied our fears about what lay beyond the reach of human understanding. The birth of the dragon marked the end of humanity's first monster. No longer did we need formless terrors lurking in the darkness. We had created something better, something that could take many forms, serve many purposes, but always retain the essential power to make us afraid.
Chapter 9. The Evolution of Terror. From the moment the dragon emerged as humanity's dominant monster archetype, it began a process of evolution that continues to this day. Each culture that encountered the dragon concept modified it according to their own fears, values, and understanding of the world. The result was not a single monster, but a family of related creatures that share common ancestry while adapting to local conditions. In medieval Europe, the dragon became inextricably linked with Christian symbolism. It was the serpent of Eden grown to enormous proportions, the embodiment of Satan's power to corrupt and destroy. Saints like George and Michael became dragon slayers, their victories representing the triumph of faith over the forces of darkness. But even within Christianity, the dragon retained its fundamental ambiguity. In the Book of Revelation, the dragon is clearly identified with Satan and ultimate evil. Yet, in earlier Christian traditions, particularly those influenced by Gnostic thought, the serpent was sometimes seen as a bringer of knowledge, the entity that freed humanity from the ignorance imposed by a tyrannical creator. This theological complexity was reflected in the secular literature of the medieval period. The dragons of Romance literature were not simply evil creatures to be destroyed. They were guardians of treasure, keepers of wisdom, and sometimes even allies of heroes who proved themselves worthy. The dragon Fafnir in the Volsunga saga guards not just gold, but the knowledge of fate itself. Only by defeating Fafnir can Sigurd gain the wisdom necessary to fulfill his destiny. In Asia, the dragon underwent an even more dramatic transformation. Rather than representing chaos and evil, the Asian dragon became a symbol of imperial power, natural harmony, and cosmic order. The Chinese emperor was the son of heaven, but he was also the earthly incarnation of the dragon. To harm a dragon was to commit treason against the cosmic order itself. This transformation reflected a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship between humanity and the natural world. Where European dragons were typically depicted as living in opposition to human civilization, dwelling in caves, hoarding treasure, laying waste to the countryside, Asian dragons were integrated into the natural and social order. They brought rain to nourish crops, protected the righteous, and served as intermediaries between heaven and earth. Yet even these benevolent dragons retained the essential characteristics that made them monstrous. They were immense power that operated according to their own inscrutable logic. They could be allies of humanity, but they could never be controlled or fully understood. They remained fundamentally other, fundamentally beyond the reach of human comprehension. The Renaissance and Enlightenment periods saw attempts to rationalize the dragon, to explain it in terms of natural history rather than supernatural terror. Scholars proposed that dragon legends were based on dinosaur fossils or surviving populations of large reptiles. Explorers reported encounters with crocodiles and monitor lizards
that might have inspired dragon stories in ancient times. But these rationalist explanations missed the essential point. Dragons had never been about biology. They had always been about psychology. They represented not the fear of large reptiles, but the fear of the unknown itself, the terror of forces beyond human control or understanding.
Chapter 10: The Modern Monster.
As humanity entered the modern era, our relationship with monsters underwent a fundamental transformation. The scientific revolution had banished many of the traditional sources of fear. Disease was understood in terms of germs rather than demons. Natural disasters were explained by geological and meteorological forces rather than divine wrath. And the exploration of the globe had eliminated most of the blank spaces on maps where monsters might hide. Yet rather than disappearing, monsters adapted to this new environment. They moved from the external world into the internal realm of psychology and scientific speculation. The result was a new generation of monsters that were arguably more terrifying than anything our ancestors had imagined. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein gave birth to the monster of uncontrolled science, the creature created by human ambition and hubris. Victor Frankenstein's monster was not a force of nature or a divine punishment. It was a direct product of human knowledge and creativity turned monstrous. It represented the fear that our own capabilities might ultimately destroy us. Bram Stoker's Dracula took the ancient fear of the predator that walks among us and updated it for an age of urbanization and global travel. The vampire was no longer a local threat that could be contained by traditional rituals and community knowledge. It was a cosmopolitan monster that could move freely through modern society, using the very technologies of progress, trains, ships, telegraph, to spread its influence. But perhaps the most significant development in modern monster concepts was the emergence of the psychological monster, the beast that exists within the human mind itself. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde literalized the ancient understanding that the greatest monster is the one that lives within us. Edgar Allan Poe's narrators confronted monsters that existed in the borderland between perception and madness. This internalization of the monstrous reflected the modern understanding of consciousness as a complex, fragmented entity rather than a unified whole. The monster was no longer something external that threatened civilization. It was an integral part of the civilized mind itself. The 20th century saw this trend accelerate with the emergence of cosmic horror in the works of H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's monsters represented something unprecedented in the history of human fear. Entities so alien that human consciousness literally could not comprehend them without breaking down entirely. His creatures were not evil in any moral sense, because morality itself was a human concept that had no meaning on the cosmic scale they inhabited. Lovecraft's innovation was to recognize that the most terrifying monsters were not those that threatened to kill us, but those that threatened to reveal the ultimate meaninglessness of human existence. His great old ones and outer gods represented the fear that we are not the center of the universe, that our values and beliefs are local accidents rather than cosmic truths, and that the universe itself is indifferent to our existence. This cosmic perspective on monsters reflected the broader crisis of meaning that characterized the modern era. Traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, tradition, had been weakened by scientific discovery and technological change. In this context, monsters became symbols not just of external threat, but of internal emptiness.
Chapter 11: The Digital Beast. As humanity moved into the digital age, our monsters once again adapted to new environments and new fears. The connected world of the internet created new forms of anonymity, new ways for predators to hunt, and new sources of existential anxiety about the nature of reality itself. The monsters of digital horror often reflected fears about the dissolution of the boundary between the virtual and the real. In films like The Ring, supernatural entities could travel through electronic media, bringing ancient curses into modern homes through television screens and videotapes. In novels like William Gibson's Neuromancer, artificial intelligences emerged in cyberspace as entities with their own agendas and incomprehensible forms of consciousness. But perhaps the most significant development in digital age monsters was the emergence of the viral entity, monsters that spread through information networks rather than physical contact. These creatures existed not as biological entities, but as patterns of information that could replicate and evolve. They represented the fear that, in a connected world, consciousness itself might be vulnerable to infection. The SCP Foundation, a collaborative fiction project that began on internet forums, represents the culmination of this trend. SCP entities are monsters that exist in a bureaucratic framework of containment and study. They are categorized, numbered, and subjected to scientific analysis, yet they remain fundamentally incomprehensible and threatening. The SCP universe reflects a distinctly modern approach to monsters, the recognition that the proper response to the inexplicable is not heroic confrontation or religious exorcism, but systematic study and institutional management. Yet the monsters themselves resist these attempts at control, constantly evolving new forms and capabilities that challenge human understanding. This bureaucratic approach to monsters reflects broader anxieties about the role of institutions in modern life. The monsters of the SCP universe are contained not by heroes or saints, but by faceless organizations that operate according to protocols and procedures. The individual human being becomes largely irrelevant in the face of institutional monster management. The digital age has also seen the emergence of monsters that exist primarily as memes, units of cultural information that spread through online communities. Slender Man, perhaps the most successful internet-born monster, began as a series of photoshopped images, but evolved into a full mythological entity with its own lore, rituals, and tragic real-world consequences. The Slender Man phenomenon demonstrated that monsters could still emerge spontaneously from collective human imagination, even in an age of global communication and scientific skepticism. It also showed that the line between fictional monsters and real psychological effects remained dangerously thin. As we reach the end of our journey through the history of humanity's first monster, we find ourselves confronting a profound paradox. Despite thousands of years of scientific progress, technological advancement, and cultural evolution, we remain as fascinated by monsters as our earliest ancestors. The cave paintings of Lascaux and the digital creations of modern horror share a common thread: the human need to give form to formless fear, to create concrete representations of abstract anxiety. The monsters may change their appearance, their habitat, and their methods, but their essential function remains constant. They serve as mirrors, reflecting our deepest fears about ourselves and our place in the universe. They are the guardians of the threshold, marking the boundaries between the known and the unknown, the civilized and the wild, the human and the other. They are the challenges we must face to prove our humanity and the reminders of the darkness that lies within us all. But perhaps most importantly, they are the proof that human imagination is itself a kind of monster, a force that can create entities more powerful and enduring than their creators. The monsters we have made have outlived the civilizations that created them. They have adapted to new environments, evolved new capabilities, and found new ways to terrify and fascinate us. Humanity's first monster, the formless fear that drove our ancestors to create ritual circles in limestone caves, has never truly died. It has simply taken on new forms, adopted new strategies, and found new ways to manifest in human consciousness. Every time we think we have explained away the monstrous, it returns in a new guise, reminding us that there are still mysteries in the world, still spaces where reason fails and primal fear takes hold. The dragon may have become the most successful monster in human history, but it was not humanity's last monster. Each generation creates new monsters to reflect its own fears and anxieties. Each culture develops its own methods of confronting and integrating the monstrous. The process that began in the caves of our ancestors continues in the digital networks of our present, and it will continue in whatever future we create for ourselves. We are the species that makes monsters, and monsters are what make us human. In the endless dance between civilization and chaos, between reason and fear, between the known and the unknown, monsters serve as our partners, our adversaries, and ultimately our teachers. They show us who we are by showing us what we are not. They define the boundaries of our humanity by embodying everything that lies beyond those boundaries. The story of humanity's first monster is therefore also the story of humanity itself. It is the story of consciousness confronting its own limits, of imagination creating entities more powerful than reality, and of the eternal struggle to understand our place in a universe that remains, despite all our efforts, fundamentally mysterious. In the end, we do not conquer monsters. We do not explain them away or eliminate them from our consciousness. We integrate them. We learn from them, and ultimately, we become them. For in a universe where consciousness itself is the most improbable and wondrous thing that has ever emerged, perhaps we are all monsters, impossible creatures of matter and mind, of flesh and dream, of fear and wonder. The first monster was the fear of the unknown. The last monster will be the fear of what we ourselves might become. Between the first and the last lies the entire history of human consciousness, written in the shadows we cast and the nightmares we create.
This is the real history of humanity's first monster. It is the story of us all. The darkness that our ancestors feared in the depths of caves still exists, but now it carries a different name. It is the darkness of space, the darkness of the deep ocean, the darkness of our own unconscious minds. It is the reminder that for all our knowledge and technology, we remain creatures haunted by mysteries we may never solve. Our monsters have evolved, but they have not disappeared. They have simply found new ways to remind us that we are not the masters of the universe we imagined ourselves to be. They are the eternal others, the permanent strangers, the shadows that give meaning to our light. And perhaps that is as it should be. For a world without monsters would be a world without mystery, without wonder, without the very thing that makes us human, the capacity to imagine something greater and more terrible than ourselves. The first monster lives on, in every story we tell, in every fear we face, in every shadow we cast. It is our constant companion on the journey from darkness into light, and from light back into darkness again. It is the proof that we are alive, that we are conscious, and that we are forever, beautifully, terrifyingly human.